The power failed just after noon, when the outside temperature reached 114 degrees, and within seconds the nursing home's air conditioning, elevators, and backup cooling systems all went silent. 43 military veterans, most in their late 70s and 80s, suddenly found themselves trapped inside a brick building that had begun turning into an oven. Oxygen concentrators switched to battery mode. Heart monitors flashed low-power warnings, and confused residents started asking why the fans had stopped. Emily Carter had arrived less than 20 minutes earlier from the emergency department to help with routine staff shortages. To nearly everyone in the building, she was simply an ER nurse filling an extra shift. The administrator, Linda Brooks, hurried through the hallway, clutching a phone that could barely maintain a signal. "The utility company says they don't know how long it'll be," she announced, trying to keep her voice steady. Several aides exchanged nervous glances before someone muttered, "The generator should have kicked in." It hadn't. A maintenance supervisor slammed another breaker into place, but nothing happened except another warning light turning red. The building was now running only on scatter battery backups that would not last long in this heat. As staff members argued over whether to begin moving residents outside, Emily stopped in the middle of the hallway and looked up instead of around. She listened for several seconds, then walked toward an equipment room without saying why. When she opened the door, she found the emergency ventilation unit completely still. She checked the control panel, then stepped back into the hallway. "Don't move anyone outside yet," she said. "The asphalt's over 150 degrees by now. Half these residents won't tolerate that transfer." One nurse frowned immediately. "If we stay inside, they'll overheat." Emily nodded once. "Only if we leave them where they are." The charge nurse folded her arms. "You're here to help, Emily, not run the building." Emily didn't argue. Instead, she glanced toward the west-facing windows where sunlight poured directly into several resident rooms. "Close every blind on this side now. Move anyone near those windows into interior hallways first. Bring wet towels, not ice packs. We need controlled cooling, not sudden temperature shock." The room fell quiet for only a moment before the maintenance supervisor shook his head. "We don't have enough staff to start relocating everyone." Emily looked toward the patient census board mounted beside the nurse's station. She scanned the names almost instantly. "You don't have to move everyone," she replied. "Move the oxygen-dependent residents first, then anyone with advanced heart failure. Everyone else can wait." A young aide whispered to another employee. How did she figure that out without opening a single chart? Before anyone answered, an alarm sounded from room 214. An elderly veteran's portable oxygen concentrator flashed a low battery warning almost 40 minutes earlier than expected. Staff rushed toward the room, but Emily reached the doorway first. She didn't touch the machine immediately. Instead, she watched the patient's breathing, counted silently, checked the color around his lips, then turned toward the respiratory cart parked outside. "Bring me the manual oxygen cylinder," she said. The respiratory technician hesitated. "Battery still shows 23%. Protocol says we wait." Emily met his eyes. "The battery isn't failing first. The concentrator is overheating." He looked back at the display, uncertain. 2 seconds later, the machine emitted a sharp warning tone, shut itself off completely, and the room froze in stunned silence. As the technician hurried to replace the oxygen supply, Emily looked down the hallway and noticed an elderly man in a wheelchair staring directly at her. He wore no uniform now, only a faded veteran's home sweatshirt, but his expression had changed. He wasn't watching her like a patient watching a nurse. He was watching her the way someone studies a familiar battlefield, try to remember where they had seen those decisions before. The respiratory technician swapped the failed concentrator with a portable oxygen cylinder, and the veteran's breathing gradually steadied. But relief lasted only a few seconds before another aide rushed toward the nurse's station. "Room 127 just lost battery power too," she called out. The administrator looked from one employee to another, realizing the failures were spreading faster than anyone expected. Emily stepped to the whiteboard, scanned the room numbers already marked with oxygen support, and said, "Stop assigning staff by hallway. Assign them by medical risk instead." Linda Brooks hesitated. "We always divide by wing." Emily shook her head. "Today the building is not the problem. Heat stress is. The highest risk residents are scattered across every wing." A few staff members exchanged uncertain looks, but nobody moved immediately. They had followed the same emergency plan for years, and changing it in the middle of a crisis felt reckless. Emily picked up a marker and circled 8 room numbers. "These people cannot wait for the schedule to catch up." One licensed practical nurse frowned. "You have not even reviewed every chart." Emily pointed toward the medication cart. "I do not need every chart. I need to know who cannot compensate for rising body temperature." She identified a resident with severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, another recovering from heart surgery, and a diabetic whose medications increased dehydration risk. Her reasoning was concise, based entirely on conditions every nurse recognized. Linda finally nodded. "Do it her way." Within minutes, the highest-risk residents were relocated to interior corridors where the temperature was several degrees cooler. Folding tables became treatment stations, bottled water was rationed, and damp towels were rotated every few minutes. The change slowed the growing confusion, but it also exposed another problem. Ice supplies were disappearing much faster than expected. One aide suggested placing every remaining bag directly onto the residents' necks and chests. Emily stopped her before she opened the cooler. "No, save the ice for drinking water and cooling the rooms." The aide looked surprised. "But colder is better." Emily answered without raising her voice. "Not if we waste it in the first hour. Evaporation from damp towels will last longer than direct ice." A few employees remained unconvinced, yet they followed her instructions because there was no better option. Nearly 30 minutes later, the cooler held enough ice to continue lowering drinking water temperatures while several neighboring facilities had already exhausted theirs after receiving the same utility outage alert. Even the skeptical nurse admitted under her breath, she saw that coming. The hallway gradually settled into an organized rhythm instead of panic, but Emily's attention kept drifting toward the ceiling. She paused beside an air return vent and held the back of her hand beneath it. Nothing. Then she walked to another corridor and repeated the same motion. A maintenance worker noticed. "Looking for airflow?" Emily nodded. "Looking for trapped heat." He shrugged. "Every vent is dead." "Not exactly," she replied. "Some sections are heating faster than others because the roof above them is taking direct afternoon sun." Before he could respond, she instructed staff to move another group of residents 20 feet farther into the building. Several employees questioned whether such a short distance could matter. Less than 15 minutes later, a handheld thermometer showed the original hallway had climbed almost 6 degrees higher than the interior corridor. The maintenance workers stared at the display, then back at Emily without saying a word. Across the room, the elderly veteran who had been watching her since the oxygen failure slowly reached into the pocket of his faded sweatshirt and removed an old pair of military dog tags. He looked at them for several seconds, then at Emily again, his expression filled not with recognition, but with the uneasy feeling that something about the way she thought refused to fit the story everyone believed about an ordinary emergency room nurse. The hallway had become an improvised treatment area, but the temperature continued climbing with every passing minute. Staff members were working harder now, yet fatigue was beginning to show. An aide approached Emily carrying another case of bottled water. "We should give everyone as much as they can drink," she suggested. Emily stopped her before the bottles were handed. "Ow! Not everyone needs the same amount." The aide looked confused. "They are all overheated." Emily knelt beside an elderly resident whose hands were swollen from heart failure. "Some of them could become just as sick if we overload them with fluids." She instructed the team to separate residents into hydration groups based on medical history instead of handing out identical amounts. A few employees questioned whether such detailed sorting was realistic during an emergency, But Emily simply pointed toward the medication records already attached to each wheelchair. The information is already here. We just have to use it. The staff divided into small teams, and within 20 minutes the process became noticeably smoother. Residents who had been growing weaker stopped complaining of dizziness, while those with heart conditions avoided unnecessary fluid overload. Linda Brooks watched the organized flow of patients and quietly admitted to herself that the building no longer felt like it was falling apart. Even the skeptical charge nurse found herself repeating Emily's instructions to newer aides without realizing it. The first real victory was not dramatic. No alarm sounded. No miracle happened. Instead, the entire facility became calmer because one practical decision had prevented several predictable medical problems before they began. As confidence slowly returned, another resident suddenly slumped sideways in his wheelchair after becoming disoriented. 2 employees rushed toward him and immediately reached for a cooling blanket. Emily intercepted them with a raised hand. She crouched beside the veteran, checked his pulse, looked into his eyes, then noticed the untouched lunch tray beside his chair. She asked one simple question. "Did anyone check his blood sugar this afternoon?" The room fell silent. In the chaos, nobody had. A glucometer confirmed his glucose level had dropped dangerously low. Within minutes, after appropriate treatment, the veteran became alert again. One nurse exhaled sharply. "We almost treated heat exhaustion when it was something completely different." Emily answered, "Heat makes every diagnosis harder. That is why we verify before." Assuming. Several staff members looked at her differently after that. She was no longer the temporary emergency room nurse helping with extra hands. She was the person seeing patterns everyone else kept missing. The maintenance supervisor approached Linda and spoke in a lowered voice. "She keeps making decisions before the problem fully appears." Linda could only nod. She had noticed the same thing, but could not explain it. Emily never seemed rushed, yet she always arrived where the next issue was about to develop. As the afternoon wore on, the residents themselves began noticing her unusual habits. She checked watches instead of clocks, estimated treatment intervals without writing reminders, and instinctively positioned supply carts where staff would naturally pass instead of where storage rules normally place them. None of it seemed extraordinary alone, yet together it created an efficiency no one remembered seeing before. The elderly veteran who had been silently observing her all afternoon watched one more detail that made him narrow his eyes. When Emily finished securing an oxygen cylinder, she wrapped the tubing with a compact knot that kept it from tangling while allowing it to release instantly if needed. It was not a standard hospital technique, and none of the younger nurses recognized it. The old veteran slowly rubbed the worn military dog tags resting in his hand, staring at the knot with growing uncertainty, as though he had seen that exact method somewhere decades earlier but could not remember where. And before he could search his memory any further, a loud crash echoed from the far end of the building, followed immediately by someone shouting that another resident had collapsed. The shout came from the east hallway, where another resident had slid from his chair while staff rushed between treatment stations. Emily reached the scene within seconds, but instead of immediately lifting the man, she stopped everyone else with a single sentence. "Nobody move him until we know why he fell." An aide insisted that heat exhaustion was the obvious cause after hours without air conditioning. Emily crouched beside the veteran, checked his airway, pulse, skin temperature, and then noticed one hearing aide lying several feet away from his wheelchair. She looked toward the polished floor, followed the faint scrape marks left by the chair, and said, "His will caught the uneven transition strip. He fell first. The heat came after." The maintenance supervisor examined the floor and found the loose metal strip exactly where Emily had indicated. Had they lifted the resident immediately, nobody would have noticed the hazard waiting for the next wheelchair. Within minutes, the strip was secured, preventing another accident before it happened. The staff exchanged quiet glances. Once again, she had solved more than the problem everyone could see. As the afternoon wore on, The building settled into a strange rhythm. Every few minutes, Emily seemed to appear wherever the next complication was developing. Never because someone called her there, but because she had already anticipated what would happen. Linda Brooks began noticing something unusual. Emily never asked where supplies were stored, yet she consistently reached the correct cabinet on her first attempt, selecting only the equipment actually needed instead of wasting time searching through drawers. Linda was certain they had never worked together before. She almost asked how Emily knew the layout, but another emergency interrupted the thought before the question left her lips. At the far end of the hallway, one of the volunteers struggled to organize replacement oxygen cylinders after several labels had become damp and difficult to read. Emily picked up a marker, arranged the cylinders into separate rows by remaining pressure and valve type, then positioned the full S tanks closest to the highest risk residents. Nobody had instructed her to do it that way. The respiratory technician paused, studying the arrangement. That is actually the fastest rotation pattern. Emily simply replied, "It keeps people from grabbing the wrong cylinder under stress." The technician frowned, as though trying to remember where he had seen the same system before, but the memory never fully surfaced. Nearby, Colonel Richard Hayes continued watching every movement without interrupting. His attention was no longer on Emily herself, but on the tiny habits surrounding her work. She always placed critical equipment in exactly the same orientation, faced labels outward without looking twice, and unconsciously checked every patient's hands before speaking to them, as though skin color, temperature, and grip told her something other people overlooked. None of those habits appeared in hospital orientation manuals, yet every one of them proved useful throughout the afternoon. Hayes leaned back in his wheelchair, his expression becoming increasingly unsettled. It was not recognition. It was familiarity without explanation. As another hour passed, the outdoor temperature climbed even higher, forcing everyone inside to conserve both energy and supplies. Emily stepped into a small storage room, searching for additional cooling towels. While reaching toward the upper shelf, her identification badge swung forward before slipping beneath her scrub top again. It happened for less than a second, but Hayes caught a glimpse of the back of the badge instead of the front. Affixed behind the hospital identification card was a small, faded strip of olive-colored tape with a neatly handwritten sequence of letters and numbers that looked nothing like hospital inventory markings. Emily instinctively tucked the badge back into place without noticing anyone had seen it, while Hayes stared after her with growing uncertainty, unable to understand why such an ordinary object suddenly reminded him of something he had not thought about in decades. Emily returned from the storage room, carrying only the supplies she actually needed when another urgent call echoed through the building. A resident with advanced heart failure had become increasingly short of breath despite receiving supplemental oxygen. Several staff members assumed the rising temperature alone was responsible and began preparing additional oxygen flow. Emily stopped beside the bed, listened to the man's breathing, checked the oxygen tubing from end to end, then followed it behind the wheelchair. One wheel had rolled onto the line, partially flattening it beneath its weight. "Lift the wheel first," she said. The tubing sprang back into shape. The oxygen flow immediately improved, and within moments the veteran's breathing eased without increasing the oxygen setting. The respiratory technician stared at the pressure gauge before looking back at Emily. Everyone was treating the symptom, he admitted. "You found the cause." Word spread through the nursing home almost instantly. Employees who had doubted her earlier stopped questioning every instruction. Instead of waiting for problems to become emergencies, they began asking what she wanted checked next. Emily never acted like she had taken command, yet the building gradually started moving around her decisions. She directed aides to rotate residents into cooler sections before they became exhausted, instructed staff to document changing mental status instead of relying on memory, and reminded everyone to monitor medications requiring refrigeration before temperatures reached unsafe levels. None of those choices looked dramatic on their own, but together they prevented small problems from becoming larger ones. Linda Brooks realized something that unsettled her. Emily was not merely responding to each crisis. She was staying one step ahead of it. As staff confidence grew, Colonel Richard Hayes slowly wheeled himself toward the nurse's station, carrying the old military dog tags he had been holding all afternoon. He watched Emily organize another supply cart using the same deliberate sequence he had noticed before. After several silent seconds, he looked down at the faded strip of olive tape he had glimpsed behind her identification badge earlier, then back at the compact release, not securing an oxygen cylinder. He said nothing to Emily. Instead, he quietly asked the respiratory technician, "Has she worked here long?" "Today is actually her first shift with us," the technician answered. Hayes frowned. Strange. He looked toward Emily again, his expression filled with thoughtful uncertainty rather than confidence. "I have seen that knot and that equipment layout somewhere before. A very long time ago." The technician followed Hayes's gaze, but offered no explanation because he had none. Emily continued caring for residents without noticing the conversation. A few minutes later, an emergency medical services crew arrived with additional bottled oxygen and cooling supplies after responding to requests from multiple facilities affected by the blackout. One experienced paramedic stepped through the entrance, immediately scanned the temporary treatment area, and stopped walking. His eyes moved across the organized oxygen rotation, the triage layout inside the hallway, and the handwritten patient tracking board Emily had created from ordinary clipboards and colored markers. He did not address the room. He simply stood there for a moment studying the arrangement before speaking almost to himself. Whoever organized this has worked major heat incidents before. Linda pointed toward Emily. "Our temporary emergency room nurse." The paramedic looked at Emily with visible curiosity but did not approach her. Instead, he continued examining the hallway as though comparing it with a distant memory he could not fully recover. Colonel Hayes noticed the same expression cross the paramedic's face that he himself had been feeling all afternoon. Two strangers, neither able to explain why, had independently recognized something familiar in an ordinary emergency room nurse. As Emily reached for another patient chart, her identification badge slipped forward once more, and this time the olive tape remained visible just long enough for the paramedic's eyes to narrow before he whispered a single puzzled question under his breath. Why would an emergency room nurse still carry a field marking like that? The paramedic kept his question to himself and immediately joined the staff, helping unload additional cooling supplies instead of pursuing an answer. Emily acknowledged him with a brief nod before returning to the residence, already assigning the new oxygen cylinders to patients whose reserves were running lowest. The way she integrated the fresh supplies into the existing rotation required no explanation. The paramedic simply adjusted to her system because it already made sense. Watching from the hallway, Linda Brooks realized something remarkable. Nobody had formally placed Emily in charge, yet experienced emergency responders were naturally fitting into the structure she had built. The respect forming around her no longer came from curiosity alone. It came from results that every person in the building could see. As another hour passed, the heat continued pressing against the old brick walls, but the temporary treatment area remained organized. Emily stopped beside Colonel Richard Hayes to check his pulse and hydration status before moving to the next resident. Hayes glanced toward the faded strip of olive tape tucked behind her identification badge, and then quietly asked, "How long have you worked emergency medicine?" Emily finished recording his vital signs before answering. Long enough to know that preparation matters more than panic. It was a simple reply that revealed almost nothing, yet Hayes noticed she had answered the question without actually answering it. He did not press further. Instead, he watched her move to another resident whose cooling towel had already begun drying out, replacing it before the patient complained of discomfort. Nearby, the visiting paramedic was helping an aide connect replacement oxygen when he noticed the compact release not securing another cylinder. He smiled faintly, almost unconsciously. "One of my instructors used to insist on tying them exactly like that," he said while loosening the line. Said it came from field medicine because you could release everything with one pull if conditions changed. He looked toward Emily. I have not seen anyone use it in years. Emily merely thanked him for bringing the new cylinders and continued checking medication temperatures inside a portable cooler. She neither confirmed nor denied what he had noticed. The conversation ended there, but several staff members had heard it, and the hallway grew noticeably quieter. Linda found herself replaying the afternoon in her mind. The oxygen tubing, the hydration planning, the hallway relocation, the equipment layout, the cooling strategy, the constant anticipation of problems. None of it depended on luck. Each decision reflected experience earned somewhere beyond an ordinary hospital shift. Even so, Emily never sought recognition. Every time someone thanked her, she redirected attention back to the residents, reminding everyone which patient needed reassessment next. That humility affected the staff as much as her clinical judgment. The administrator realized that the building had remained functional not because one person had performed miracles, but because one nurse had quietly enabled everyone else to perform better. As evening shadows finally stretched across the windows, an exhausted aide approached Emily, carrying a small cardboard box recovered from an interior storage closet that had been cleared to create more treatment space. I think this belongs to you, she said. Emily looked surprised. She opened the box just enough to confirm its contents before closing it again. Resting inside was an old stainless steel stethoscope, carefully wrapped around a weathered fabric pouch that bore a faded embroidered medical insignia unlike anything used by the nursing home or the hospital. Emily paused for the first time all day, her expression softening for only a heartbeat before she lifted the box and carried it toward an empty supply room. Colonel Hayes noticed the insignia from across the hallway. His eyes widened slightly, not because he understood the whole story, but because he was suddenly certain he had seen that symbol once before under circumstances he had never forgotten. Emily stepped out of the supply room, carrying the old stethoscope and fabric pouch only long enough to place them safely inside her locker before returning to the hallway, as though nothing had happened. She immediately resumed checking residents, replacing cooling towels, reassessing breathing patterns, and coordinating the final oxygen rotation before another battery reached its limit. At nearly the same moment, the utility company restored power to part of the neighborhood. Lights flickered once, then twice before the air conditioning units slowly came back to life. A wave of cool air gradually spread through the building, and the tension that had gripped the nursing home for hours finally began to ease. Staff members looked around almost in disbelief. Every one of the 43 veterans was still alive, stable, and accounted for. Linda Brooks lowered herself into a chair, realizing how close the day had come to ending very differently. The visiting paramedic walked beside Emily while helping disconnect temporary oxygen cylinders that were no longer needed. As he handed back one of the portable tanks, his eyes settled again on the faded olive tape behind her identification badge. This time he spoke more carefully. That marking is not from emergency medical services, is it? Emily paused for only a moment before answering. It is from another chapter of my life. She offered nothing more and returned to checking the final medication refrigerator after electricity stabilized. The paramedic nodded respectfully. He did not ask another question because, after watching her work for hours, he understood that her actions had already answered the important ones. Colonel Richard Hayes slowly rose from his wheelchair with the assistance of a walker. Every employee nearby instinctively moved toward him, worried that the exhausting afternoon had become too much for the elderly veteran. Instead, Hayes took several careful steps until he stood in front of Emily. He studied her face for a long moment before looking down at the compact release, not securing the last oxygen cylinder waiting to be returned. Then he glanced toward the fabric pouch she had briefly carried from the storage room. I remember now, he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. That knot, that equipment discipline, and that medical insignia. I saw them during a joint military disaster response many years ago. The combat medics running that field hospital kept hundreds of people alive through extreme heat after every system around them failed. He did not claim to know Emily personally, nor did he pretend to know everything about her past. He simply looked at her with the certainty of someone who had finally connected scattered pieces that had refused to fit together all afternoon. The paramedic quietly added, "That explains why your treatment area looked familiar. It was built using field medicine principles adapted for civilians." Neither man tried to tell Emily's story for her. They only confirmed what everyone inside the building had already witnessed with their own eyes. Linda Brooks looked around the hallway and realized the greatest evidence had never been hidden in an old badge, a faded symbol, or a forgotten knot. It was the fact that one nurse had transformed confusion into coordinated care without seeking authority, recognition, or praise. Several employees who had questioned Emily's decisions earlier stepped forward one after another to thank her. Some shook her hand. Others simply stood beside her in respectful silence. Emily accepted every gesture with the same modest smile before reminding an aide to continue offering water because several residents were still recovering from dehydration despite the restored electricity. Even after the crisis had ended, her attention remained fixed on the patients rather than herself. Colonel Hayes slowly raised his right hand into a formal military salute. No one instructed the other veterans to respond, yet one after another they followed him as best they could, some standing, some remaining seated, each offering the same quiet gesture of gratitude. Emily looked visibly moved, but instead of returning a military salute, she simply placed a hand over her heart and said, "I am grateful all of you made it through today." The hallway remained silent for several seconds until the charge nurse noticed that one resident had not yet awakened from an exhausted sleep after the long afternoon. Emily immediately walked toward his bedside to reassess him, reminding everyone that although the emergency was finally ending, their responsibility to the people in their care had not. The restored air conditioning slowly brought the temperature back under control, and for the first time that afternoon, the nursing home sounded like itself again. The constant alarms had faded. Conversations no longer carried the sharp edge of panic, and exhausted staff members finally allowed themselves to breathe. Emily made one final round through every treatment area, checking oxygen levels, hydration status, and medication storage before signing off each patient. Nobody questioned why she continued working with the same focus after the emergency had ended. They had all seen enough to understand that finishing well mattered just as much as responding quickly. Linda Brooks followed several steps behind her, not to supervise, but to learn. Earlier that day, she had introduced Emily as temporary help. Now she found herself quietly memorizing the sequence Emily used to evaluate every resident, because she realized it should become part of the facility's emergency procedures. Without making an announcement, Linda asked another employee to preserve the handwritten patient tracking board exactly as Emily had organized it. The respiratory technician carefully rewound every oxygen line using the same release method Emily had demonstrated throughout the afternoon. One of the younger nurses noticed and instinctively copied him. No one referred to it as Emily's technique. It had simply become the new way of preparing equipment because everyone had watched it work under pressure. Even the maintenance supervisor, who had doubted several of her early decisions, walked through the hallways inspecting the transition strips and ventilation patterns she had identified, making permanent repairs before another emergency could expose the same weaknesses. Colonel Richard Hayes remained near the nurses' station, watching the residents settle comfortably into cooler rooms. One by one, the veterans who had struggled through the long afternoon stopped by Emily's workstation before returning to their rooms. Some offered a firm handshake. Others simply touched the brim of an old cap or nodded with quiet appreciation. None of them spoke for long because none of them needed to. Their gratitude rested in simple gestures shared between people who understood that actions often carried more weight than speeches. Emily responded to each veteran exactly the same way she had responded to every patient all day, asking whether they needed fresh water, another blanket, or help getting comfortable before moving on to the next person. The charge nurse approached Emily carrying the clipboard. She had once used to question nearly every recommendation. She did not apologize. Instead, she handed it over and said, "I updated the hydration checks the way you suggested. I think we should keep using this system." Emily reviewed the notes, smiled with quiet approval, and handed the clipboard back. "It belongs to all of you now," she replied. The simple exchange revealed more than any formal apology could have. Respect had replaced doubt because experience had replaced assumption. As evening sunlight softened through the windows, the visiting paramedic loaded the last and used oxygen cylinders back into his ambulance. Before closing the compartment door, he looked toward the entrance where Emily was helping an elderly veteran adjust his walker for the trip back to his room. He raised a hand in farewell, receiving a small wave in return, then drove away knowing he had witnessed exceptional professionalism rather than extraordinary spectacle. Inside the building, Linda noticed that Emily's shift had technically ended more than an hour earlier. She mentioned it almost apologetically, offering to find someone else to finish the remaining paperwork. Emily glanced around the hallway, making certain every resident was comfortable before accepting the forms. She completed the final chart, returned borrowed equipment to its proper place, folded the last and used cooling towels, and erased the temporary notes from the whiteboard one line at a time. By the time she placed the marker back on the tray, the nursing home no longer looked like the scene of a crisis. It looked like home again, and the people who had witnessed the day understood that the greatest act of leadership they had seen had come from someone who never once asked to be recognized for it. The last chart was filed just as the evening shift settled into its normal routine. Emily gathered her stethoscope, folded the faded fabric pouch with the same care she had shown every patient that day, and placed both inside her bag before checking one final time that every resident had fresh water within reach. She walked through the halls without ceremony, pausing only to straighten a blanket, adjust a wheelchair brake, and remind a nurse that one resident preferred taking medication after eating a few crackers. None of those small gestures would ever appear in an incident report, yet they reflected the same attention that had carried the nursing home through its hardest hours. As Emily reached the front entrance, Linda Brooks met her there with a handwritten patient tracking board that had guided the staff throughout the blackout. Instead of throwing it away with the temporary emergency supplies, Linda carefully slipped it into a clear protective sleeve. She did not call it a souvenir or a trophy. She simply placed it beside the facility's emergency preparedness binder, where future nurses would study it whenever severe weather threatened again. The respiratory technician quietly updated the oxygen storage room using the same layout Emily had introduced, while the maintenance supervisor added routine inspections of ventilation zones and floor transitions to the building's permanent safety checklist. None of them announced these changes. They simply became part of how the nursing home would care for people from that day forward. Down the hallway, Colonel Richard Hayes watched several veterans settle into comfortable chairs beneath the restored air conditioning. Earlier that afternoon, many of them had been frightened by the rising heat and failing equipment. Now conversations returned, a card game resumed in the recreation room, and a television played softly in the background. Hayes looked toward the front entrance, just in time to see Emily preparing to leave. He did not call her back. Instead, he removed his old service cap, held it respectfully against his chest for a brief moment, then placed it back on his head with a quiet smile. Around him, a few other veterans noticed the gesture and instinctively mirrored it in their own simple ways, not because anyone asked them to, but because gratitude often speaks most clearly through shared habits. Emily stepped outside into the warm evening air, where the temperature had finally begun to fall with the setting sun. She paused beside her car only long enough to glance back at the building. Lights glowed steadily through the windows. Residents moved comfortably inside, and the crisis that had begun in 114-degree heat had ended with every one of the 43 veterans alive. Satisfied that the nursing home no longer needed her, she placed her bag in the passenger seat, started the engine, and drove away without waiting for recognition or applause. Inside, Linda closed the emergency binder and looked once more at the preserved tracking board before switching off the office light. The building had gained more than a new emergency plan that day. It had gained a lasting example of what steady judgment, preparation, and compassion could accomplish when everything else failed. Long after the heat wave became just another story in the local weather records, the people who had lived through that afternoon remembered something far more important. They remembered that when the power went out, one emergency room nurse never lost sight of the people depending on her. And because she refused to stop doing the next right thing, 43 veterans were able to wake up to another morning.